Pleasure to welcome you to CCA's webinar, Hope is Not a Plan, Canadian and Mexican Strategies for North America. As most of you know, the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, otherwise known as CUSMA in Canada, as TMEC in Mexico, and USMCA in the United States, is approaching its mandated 6-year review on July 1st. Under the agreement, the three governments are expected to indicate whether they wish to extend it for another 16 years. And if they do not, the agreement doesn't end, it remains in force, but moves into a cycle of annual reviews. And so coming to our conversation today, in addition to a bunch of other rhetoric and things coming out of DC, the US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer's office has announced that trade talks with Mexico will formally begin on May 25th, while no date has been set for formal bilateral negotiations between Canada and the United States. So today we will discuss how Mexico and Canada are approaching this moment, what their respective strategies are, where they may align or diverge, and how it's all going. To do that, we're extremely fortunate to have with us three people with deep experience in the North American relationship. It's a pleasure to welcome Graeme Clark, former Canadian ambassador to Mexico, Embajador Juan José Gómez-Camacho, former Mexican ambassador to Canada, and Eric Miller, trade expert and president of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group. To start, let's set the stage on where things stand and how this review differs from the last major North American trade negotiation. So I'd like to start off by asking Eric, at this point in the process, what makes this CUSMA review different from the NAFTA renegotiation in 2017-2018? Eric, if I could ask you to jump in there.
Of course, Marta. Thank you so much for the question and for the invitation to be here. So the review process, or the renegotiation process, as many really see it, couldn't be more different than what we saw in the 2018 to 2020 period. At that time, there was a question about what needs to be changed in order for the agreement to win political support and go forward. The political context in the United States was such that Donald Trump was a new president. He had around him many advisors who were relatively old hands in trade and economic policy. He had not fully reshaped his advisor grouping like he has at this point. And so you have the U.S. now coming into these negotiations with real questions about where the very structure of the agreement is going to be. In 2018 to 20, we essentially added a few things, subtracted a few things, but the core of the agreement, which became known as TMEC, USMCA, or CUSMA, depending on the country, was substantially similar to the original North American Free Trade Agreement. This time, you are looking at a situation where fundamentally we expect, at least directionally, that seems to be where things are going, that you will have a trilateral core, but a series of bilateral agreements that stand on top of that. The Canada-Mexico relationship will be presumably covered through the relationship that exists under the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, but there will be separate U.S. and Canada and U.S. and Mexico bilateral agreements which will overlay on top of that. How they actually work and how they fit together is something that remains to be seen, and this is really very much a work in progress. I would also highlight, and certainly Ambassador Gómez-Camacho and Ambassador Clark can elaborate on this very significantly. You have very different actors. At the time that the NAFTA renegotiation took place, you had the Peña Nieto government in its final days and was carried over the line by the AMLO government in Mexico. You also had Justin Trudeau in Canada. Now you have Mark Carney and Claudia Sheinbaum. So you have a different U.S. taking a different position. You have different actors in the countries. And I think the last thing I'll say before stopping is that this title, Hope is Not a Plan, comes from what Mark Carney termed as forward guidance, ever the central banker that he is. And so he gave a speech where he essentially argued that the traditional ties that Canada has had with the United States have become a weakness and are not the strength that Canadians had once thought they were. And so even the fact that you are looking very much at a fundamental reshaping of the relationship among the three countries. 2018 to 20 was change as little as possible. Now we're in this period where everything could change depending on how the direction of the coming months goes.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. Thanks for that predicate. Graeme, if I could invite you to comment now on sort of what are the areas that Ottawa is trying to protect, improve, or actually bring into this current process. So as you know, Eric mentioned those bilaterals and what those might look like. Can you speak to sort of what you're seeing out of Ottawa in that respect?
What's fascinating, of course, is the difference in approach that the Mexican and Canadian governments are taking to this discussion, to this negotiation, to this review. The Mexicans have jumped right in. Marcelo Ebrard, who's I guess the lead negotiator, has been very active and very present in the private discussions and the public conversation on this matter. Our chief negotiator, who I think is probably Mark Carney, our Prime Minister, is I think taking a leaf out of the book of strategic patience and taking his time, and I guess waiting for the midterms or waiting for a moment in which the president might be more vulnerable, or the administration might be more vulnerable if it loses the Congress and possibly the Senate. The risk with waiting is that the president knows as well, he can read the tea leaves as well, and he might be tempted to do something that is unpredictable, which is entirely how he operates. To get to your question, I think there's certain things on the table, long-standing issues such as dairy. Is that something that we're going to want to die in a ditch for? Or is that something that we're going to want to protect? The Americans themselves have said that they're unhappy about not seeing American spirits and wines and liquor on the shelves in the LCBO and in Quebec, etc. That's an easy one for us to correct. And at the end of the day, there's the issue of sovereignty, which is important both for Mexico and for Canada. Canada from perhaps a more rhetorical point of view than from Mexico, and I'll let Juan José speak to that. But I think it's important to underline that this is not simply a trade policy negotiation. There are all sorts of other things on the table. Security issues, of course, for both countries, but perhaps notably for Mexico, that will be part of the conversation, even if they're not part necessarily of the actual trade negotiation.
Thanks, Graeme. Embajador Juan José, can you speak to that same question?
Sure.
From Mexico City perspective? So
thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me here. Let me go first quickly, if I may, to your initial question and Eric's answer, which I agree entirely with what he said. But I would add, if I may, that the politics in general are different, and something that is completely different than before, even if rhetorically was the same, is that at this time, President Trump, President Trump doesn't like NAFTA, didn't like NAFTA, but allowed the negotiation. This time, not only he doesn't like the USMCA, but it seems to be very true that he really is not happy with this going forward with the negotiation. And Jamieson Greer has a very difficult job before or in front of him. He's walking on a very fine line between pursuing the renegotiation or revision of the treaty on the one hand, and a boss that truly doesn't like it and most likely doesn't want it. That's a very fundamental difference than before. And you add to this also a trade war launched by the US and very important tariffs on the world, but also on Canada and Mexico. So the conditions are fundamentally different, the politics are fundamentally different, and the situation in the US is fundamentally different. So it's a very big challenge. Mexico's strategy and what Mexico wants. Graeme, that knows us very well, already said something extremely important. Mexico is right on it. Marcelo Ebrard is the head negotiator, and dialogue, closeness, consultations, permanent communication with the US has been key. I should say that there is also an effort between Canada and Mexico and commitments between Canada and Mexico to consult to each other, to remain in close coordination and communication as much as possible. What does Mexico want? I will say 2 or 3 things that I'm sure Canada also wants. Number one is we want the treaty to remain. Before going to what, we want the treaty to remain, which I think at this point is clear that it will remain, but still many things can happen. I think it'll happen, but that's a priority for the Mexican government, the treaty to remain. Number 2, which I think is also shared by Canada, the removal of tariffs. And not only the removal of existing tariffs like on steel and aluminum, but also certainty that no further tariffs will be imposed down the road. Because even if we successfully renegotiate the treaty, as I think we will, if in 6 months after the treaty or 1 year after the treaty is again in force or continuing in force post-negotiation, the idea that the US president can at any moment impose tariffs again kills the purpose. So that is another priority for Mexico, clearly. Another priority, as Graeme, the USTR and Marcelo Ebrard mentioned while he was in Mexico City, as you know, he was mid-April in consultations in Mexico City, is economic security. And I think this is also shared with Canada. What do we mean by economic security? Supply chains integration. The challenge of Chinese components, how are we going to deal with that? Extremely complex. That's another priority. Another priority, which is not Mexican, but it becomes a priority because it's a priority for the US, so we need to deal with that, is rules of origin and regional content. Another priority that to me seems to be very clear is critical minerals. And I would add at the end that another priority for Mexico should be how to integrate itself in areas like AI, semiconductors connected to critical minerals, meaning that instead of just being an exporter or importer of goods or integrated in other areas, Mexico can be part of the supply chains in these industries as well. So I will leave it there and we can continue talking.
Great, thank you, Embajador. Eric, if I can pull you back into the conversation, both ambassadors have mentioned some of the areas where the individual countries are looking to, and also some of the areas that both are actually interested in. Can you expand on that and maybe talk about where those alliances are? I know there's quite a few trips and back and forth between Canada and Mexico as well. So maybe speak about that alignment and
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think and I want to be careful in saying this, but I think at the highest level, one of the points of divergence that we've seen, not between Canada and Mexico, but in terms of the views vis-a-vis the US, is that, well, getting an agreement is really important for both Canada and Mexico, Canada has more taken the view, or certainly many of its esteemed statesmen have taken the view, people such as John Manley and former Prime Minister Harper, that in many respects, no deal would be better than a bad deal, which structurally discriminates against Canada in many respects. And in Mexico, given its production structure, Mexico, like any country with sophisticated negotiating teams, has its limits, but has very much been proactive in going after an agreement, simply because you've had no overt or more limited overt threats on sovereignty than on the 51st state front, because you have hundreds of thousands of jobs in northern Mexico, which are truly dependent on manufacturing for export to the U.S. And so the willingness to walk away, if needed, is different, I think, between Canada and Mexico. But both countries are really committed to wanting to see an elimination of tariffs. One of the things that Ambassador Greer has been trying to get the two countries to agree to is that some level of tariffs will be necessary. And, in essence, I give the Trump administration credit that they got the great trading nations of Europe and in Asia, with the exception of China, to essentially agree to highly unequal arrangements on trade, where essentially U.S. goods going into their countries get charged no tariffs, and their goods going into the U.S. get charged 15%. But that sort of structure does not work in a North American context, because much of North American trade is in intermediate inputs. You have massive co-production of goods moving across the borders. And so, one study that comes to mind is that in the average Mexican export to the U.S., there's 40 cents of U.S. content, roughly. I mean, it differs depending on the sector, higher, maybe in automotive. But in an export from many parts of Asia, you're looking at 3 to 5 cents of U.S. content. And so you would think that the U.S. would want to trade more with neighbors in North America, because that gives benefit to U.S. intermediate input producers that they don't get from trade elsewhere. But this is not something that seems to have gotten through. But the realities of trying to disentangle these relationships would just be very profoundly different than they would be if a relationship with Japan or Europe were to fall apart. The last thing I'll say is that as we speak, we also have two investigations going on under Section 301, which in the case of Mexico, it is included in the investigation on manufacturing overcapacity, which is a term that comes specifically out of the steel sector, but this covers a lot of manufacturing. And then we have investigations on forced labor. Now, under Article 23.4 of the USMCA, the countries have agreed and have implemented bans on the importation of goods made with forced labor, but that's not something that the U.S. has been satisfied with. And so there is a risk that tariffs will be put in place through these investigations. So even if we agree to something like free trade at the negotiating table, you could have these investigations come and impose tariffs in practice right as the agreement is being put in place. So it's a complicated mix at the moment, and while Canada and Mexico take a different perspective, I think they want substantially the same things at the end of the day.
Ambassador Juan José, did you want to make a comment on that same, on what Eric just mentioned in terms of what's coming out of DC and the position Mexico has with respect to some of that?
No, I agree. I mean, I agree in terms that it's a very complicated mix, that Mexico has a bigger degree of integration, if you like, that many jobs in Mexico depend on this treaty, and that the Mexican economy is very linked to the US. The degree of integration between Mexico and the US is enormous. Mexico is, as you know, the first trading partner of the US. We are already around 900 billion US bilateral trade. Is an enormous amount of money or resources from whatever point of view, but from the perspective of Mexico is gigantic. So for Mexico, absolutely a priority to keep this treaty alive. This does not mean that we want to keep it or Mexico wants to keep it at any price. I agree with Eric. It has to stay and improve. It has to be clearer. It has to bring back certainty in integration. It has to bring back certainty for investors. It has to bring back certainty on the rules that will apply. And once we have all this certainty, investors and companies will be able to equate all this and do their business as they do. So yes, I in general, I think I agree.
Marta, can I jump in?
Please, please.
I mean, I agree with what you said, Juan Jose, although I'm not hearing that from the Mexican government in such sort of clear terms as we have perhaps had it in Canada. That would be the first thing I'd say. The other thing that we're not hearing from, I mean, the Carney government has been, part of the rhetoric has been about diversification and seeking other markets and building trading relations outside of North America. I'm not hearing that from Mexico in the same way. And then the third thing I wanted to say is we had a discussion about a year ago, and you said that the only thing that really mattered between Canada and Mexico was the economic relationship, right? We had a difficult discussion about visas and the human relationship. Do you think that there is the possibility of a rapprochement between Mexico and Canada vis-a-vis the US beyond simply knowing what the other side is thinking or planning to do? Or are we simply going to play the game that we usually play, which is to cut a separate deal with, or try to cut a separate deal with Washington without really taking into account the third partner?
Can I?
Please go ahead. I'll leave that open to you. That's
Yeah.
for you, Juan Jose. Yes. Thank you.
Yes. I think the answer is yes. And Graeme and I worked on this a lot, you and I, Graeme, when we were both ambassadors. I can speak from the perspective of Mexico, but probably I could also say the same for Canada. Clearly, there is a strategic need for Mexico to be closer to Canada, and I think this, again, applies equally for Canada, regardless of the US. That said, the problem that Canada and Mexico have always had and probably will remain, because geography doesn't change, is that because of the sheer size of the US, the relationship between Mexico and Canada tends to be determined by our relations with the US. The US absorbs much efforts of both countries and is in the middle. We like to think that Canada and Mexico are neighbors. We are not. Geographically, we are not. We are extremely far. And again, we have the US in between. So what Mexico and Canada need to understand, and I think, again, Graeme and I understood it very well, is that Mexico's strong, Canada's strong relationship, strategic view, etc., is not automatic. Because all the forces, are many forces in between that push both countries apart. And the current US administration does it even more. I don't know if because they want, but the nature of what is happening tends to push Mexico and Canada apart because it tends to create different kinds of incentives. And both Mexico and Canada are very different countries. So to summarize, we need each other. Both countries understand it. There is more, less, but in general, a big effort to see eye to eye, to develop this strategic perception of each other. Canada just had a couple of months ago or so the largest business trip ever to Mexico, where 400 businessmen were there. Canadian ministers have been visiting Mexico. So the effort is there. But at the same time, as I was saying, in a context like the one we are, incentives differ, forces differ. There are many things pushing both countries apart, and it demands a huge effort to remain together.
Yeah.
Will we be able to do that? I hope so. But again, we've seen, Graeme and I, this on and on and on, and it's very challenging. But what I can say, I'm not in government anymore, but what I can say from what I see in Mexico is that for Mexico, this is very clear and the effort remains. Let's see.
Eric, would you want to comment on that? And can I also just add something to it? And if you
Sure,
wouldn't
go
mind
ahead.
adding into your commentary is sort of what ambassadors just mentioned about Canada and Mexico vis-a-vis the US. How do you see the US strategy playing into this in terms of not just like the divergence of the two countries, but how are they responding to some of the priorities that Canada and Mexico might have as well in the bilateral relationship and then with each other?
Yeah. So first on the Canada-Mexico relationship, I think both ambassadors are very much right. The one thing I would say that we will have to do over time is we don't really have an infrastructure in place to really build out the kind of relationships over the long term that are needed. Now, some of these things are sort of soft power, people to people, and ultimately a lot of it comes down to economics. But as far as I know, I don't think there is even a Mexican studies program at a Canadian university. You don't have a good mechanism or structured mechanism for Canadians to study in Mexico or for Mexicans to come to Canada. And so we need to build out an infrastructure so that as people progress through their careers, they become both knowledgeable of and advocates of the relationship. So
Yeah.
putting
Fair
that
enough.
aside for a moment. So the US is very focused on what we know on nearshoring manufacturing, on trying to get concessions on key issues. So we've seen, all of the discussion on dairy. One of the challenges with that is that it's as much a financial workout because there are tens of billions of dollars of credit extended to dairy farmers, and as well as being politically complicated. We have the vexing issue of Chinese content in North American supply chains, and how do rules of origin need to get restructured in order to deal with that, and ensuring that there's a good amount of rigor in the application of those rules of origin. But then you look at other things. So I pulled up Ambassador Greer's testimony to the U.S. Congress in December. And one of the things that are listed as issues to be pursued with both countries are, quote, developing mechanisms to penalize offshoring of U.S. production to Mexico or Canada as a result of regulatory or other arbitrages. Now, this sounds like the U.S. is looking for something in the agreement to essentially cap U.S. investment in neighboring countries. And so the question would be, how would that work? Yesterday, General Motors announced a $690 million investment in an engine plant in St. Catharines, a new production line of V8 engines. You have announcements of U.S. companies doing things in Mexico. Does that run afoul of these investment restrictions, and how would that be policed? And would Canada or Mexico be called somehow to compensate or to not have those investments? And so, part of where the U.S. is unresolved is, to what extent does it want, in essence, to to put its finger on all of the different sort of economic levers and relationships with the countries versus letting investors invest where they want a good return. Canada and Mexico, of course, worked very hard to make themselves attractive to investment and to try to get investment into particular sectors. And what we see is also playing out in this negotiation is the Trump administration's preference for bilateral negotiations because
Yep.
they, in the case of Mexico and Canada and most other countries, I guess, save China, the U.S. is going to be the larger player and thus have more leverage. And so the two countries are taking positions that they would see to counteract that leverage. But there are some troubling things in terms of the demands that have been put out that, if applied in the way that they are presented in the congressional testimony, would radically reshape not only the structure but the operation of the USMCA CUSMA TMEC.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Graeme, Eric, you just brought up China, and I'd like to, that is one space where both countries are dealing with it in varying degrees. Graeme, can I invite you to comment on that, and as well as Ambassador Juan José?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to just say yes.
Yes.
Obviously, that's, that should be the issue that the three countries are consulting and converging and, seeking a consensus on. It's a bit difficult with the current administration in Washington, but I've said this when I was ambassador. We need that, that discussion. But my question to Juan José, and perhaps to Eric as well, is, we're having the discussion about the trade aspects, the trade negotiation that is to come. What about the other issues on the table, the unspoken issues, the security issues, and, the political vulnerabilities in the three countries as we look at the agenda over the next, 6 months or year? And how does that impact on that negotiation? Because surely it's going to, right?
Different things here. Quickly on one comment from Eric, then I say something on China, and then Graeme's question. On the splitting Mexico and Canada and pursuing two bilateral agreements, I'm not so sure that the logic of splitting, if that's the logic, is just to make the US bigger or to have a weaker, smaller counterpart, therefore easier to deal with. The sheer asymmetry is there either way, even with Canada and Mexico. The asymmetry between the US and the two neighbors is just enormous. That's number one. And number two, the nature of the Mexican economy versus the Canadian economy, the issues, Graeme mentioned some already, are fundamentally different. And NAFTA, USMCA, and what result from this negotiation that I insist I think is going to be successful, always has had bilateral components. This time, probably more. I totally agree with that. China, we have to talk. Clearly, is a very complex issue. Is the second largest investor in Mexico. I would imagine, this I don't know, obviously, but I would imagine that the wisest here would be first to wait and see what is going to be a deal, settlement, or state of things between the US and China. Once they themselves decide how the relationship is going to continue, trade, rules, tariffs, investment, etc., I think we will have better panorama, if you like. Number two, on China, I think, so there has to be coordination between the three countries, in my view, no doubt. Second, there are areas, one critical issue in the region is security. So without judging China, clearly there are areas where Chinese investment wouldn't look advisable. Whether it's high-tech, satellites, cloud, chips, etc., for reasons that we all know. So probably the three countries would end up limiting or banning investments in very specific strategic sectors. Understood. Second, however, and probably this applies more to Mexico, but Graeme and Eric know more, is that the amount of Chinese intermediate goods in the North American supplies is very important. And we don't have anything to replace them with. So there, I think the three countries, at least Mexico, will have to be very careful. What is it what you are starting to put tariffs on? Because if you start putting tariffs on intermediate goods that are components or parts of the North American supply chains, and the goods that go to the US, Canada, and back, then we would be shooting ourselves. That is going to be an extremely complicated thing. Rules of origin, etc. On Mexico, I'm sorry, Graeme, but I got lost in China. Can you remind me what?
No, I was just, it wasn't a
Other
specific,
issues.
Because
it
you
wasn't
were
a spec-
challenging me. And
No, I'm not challenging you. I would
No,
never
I'm
do
joking.
that. I have great
No,
fondness and
I'm
respect
joking.
for you.
But just tell me.
And I think you should be going back to Ottawa at some stage. But anyway, that's for a different
No,
private
that's on
discussion. No, my question was about the political frailty and vulnerabilities in all three countries. It was not a question directed at Mexico.
No, I
It was simply, we need to take into account the political dynamics in all three countries, which are very different.
Yes.
You know, Canadians,
Except
we have
that-
national unity concerns, for instance, on the dairy front, which Eric mentioned. You have a president who's in a particularly complex moment. How does her, vulnerability vis-a-vis her own party or vis-a-vis her own, business community, how does that play into this discussion?
It does play, clearly, but I will just answer this by saying that's the arts of great politicians. Because this is not unusual, is it? Every complex international process, negotiation, foreign policy, any way you want to put it, is completely linked to the domestic political, social, economic realities of countries. And the three leaders, Prime Minister and the two presidents, have their domestic agendas, their domestic constraints, their domestic challenges, and we all have to deal with them. So I cannot go beyond this. The answer is absolutely it does affect. But on this, I trust, as I said, they are simply great politicians, and they will have to handle the very complex equilibriums they have to, particularly Canada and Mexico, they have to maintain to continue this negotiation. What is clear to me, at least in the case of Mexico, is that because of the integration between the two countries, because the integration of the Mexican economy to the US, even if we want to diversify and all that, which is good, the integration, the bulk is North American. So in order for, this is my view, in order for the Mexican government to being able to keep moving the country forward, to keep creating prosperity, to pursue economic growth, to reduce inequality, to create jobs and better paid jobs, etc., we need a very robust economic growth. And to get very robust economic growth, we need a very strong integration with the US. That's where Mexico is. It's in the north, it's neighbored with the US, and our reality is that. So that's what I would say.
Thanks so much, Ambassador. Eric, a lot has been presented by both ambassadors. Did you want to comment on a few things?
Yeah, Sure. So first of all, on the China point, I think one thing that's important to do is to compare the Canada-China agreement that was reached early in 2026 with the US-China agreement, which was reached in November of 2025. Both were remarkably similar in terms of their scope, which was moderate. The US deal talked about access for sorghum and logs. The Canadian deal talked about access for canola and lobsters. The US wanted a restart of flows of rare earths. The Chinese wanted a restart of auto exports to Canada, and then some commitments on capping future growth. And so some of the more pointed rhetoric that's come out of the US about somehow Canada now being a servant state of China or something is just not, it's not grounded in reality. And so, but the China factor will play into this, and the Canadian auto sector is tearing itself apart on these issues. And part of that is that we've seen, given how the rules of origin and the Section 232 tariffs have worked, that U.S. content has essentially been favored over Canadian and Mexican content in auto exports for the last year, and there's concerns about what that means for the long-term future of the Canadian parts sector, and so the question of how do you put the thumb on the scale, and is it North American content versus US content, or I suppose Canadian content or Mexican content, is something which is extremely important. And then, Ambassador Gómez-Camacho is very correct about, these things ultimately get managed by excellent politicians with good bureaucracies behind them. And so, each has to navigate situations of sovereignty. I mean, when I was
Absolutely.
in Mexico early in the new Trump administration, and one of the discussions I had was what's the one thing that could derail this for Mexico, and they said, undo U.S. incursions into Mexican sovereign territory.
Exactly right.
And so that's something which needs to be managed and is being managed and is an ongoing challenge. For Canada, the situation is very different. You've had the rhetoric around 51st state. You've had threats from the U.S. ambassador about flying U.S. jets into Canadian airspace without authorization, etc. And what this has done effectively is that it's closed the political space that's available to Prime Minister Carney. So I talked to somebody recently, and their question was, even if we get a good deal between the US and Canada or among the three countries, how do we convince voters that it's a good deal? Because the challenge you have is that Donald Trump, I don't think, would win a popularity contest in either Canada or Mexico. And that political space is such that it's a fine line between convincing people that we got the best deal that there was, and having opponents for political expediency simply say, well, you're weak, you didn't do this, that, or the other thing, and I could have done it better. And so when you have these kind of pointed conflicts, it does create complications around landing the deal and carrying it forward in implementation.
That's a really fascinating point, the last point that Eric made, and I'm just wondering where's the Mexican threshold, in terms of what would be an acceptable or not acceptable deal, or is that issue even on the table? I mean, can Mexicans even conceive of not having the USMCA or the CUSMA, I should say?
I don't think so, but that would be a question to ask to President Sheinbaum. Not to me. I really don't know, but I think Mexico is convinced that there will be a treaty, and a good treaty. And me too.
Yeah.
I am genuinely persuaded that we will, or Mexico will, be very successful in getting this done. Not only because I have to say, Mexico has great capacity to do this, but also because there is a very strong US private sector pushing very seriously for the not only survival, but the positive strengthening of the treaty. It's not just that it's a big country with two smaller neighbors that want to jump in and hanging next to the US, sucking from the US. This is a very integrated industrial sectors, very integrated production between the three, or let me speak between Mexico and Canada, massive US investment in Mexico, enormous benefits for US consumers, for US workers, and I could keep going on and on and on. So whenever you see American companies discussing all this process in the US, is all in favor and also putting pressure to continue it. So on this issue, it's not only Mexico and Canada that are, let me use the word alone, or only you and us trying to negotiate. There is an enormous constituency within the US, economic and political, that is also behind the treaty. So frankly, I think, let's see what sort of treaty ends, where are the changes, where are the modifications, how it looks like in the end. But I think I'm absolutely convinced there will be a treaty. And I think it will be a good treaty. Is it going to be perfect? Clearly not. Is it going to be what we all would love? Clearly not. The world has changed. The US has changed. The notion of free trade has changed. But overall, I think it's going to remain, and I think it's going to be good.
Great. Thank you.
Maybe it's hope.
Hope is
a strategy.
Yes, exactly.
I am persuaded that is going to happen. And I can see Mexico is very interesting. Let's see.
Thanks so much, Embajador. Graeme, I'm going to come back to you on this because it's not but I do want to ask you in the same sort of strain that you just asked Embajador Gómez-Camacho, is what constitutes a bad deal for Canada? And then I'll also just add to that, how would you, what strategy has Canada sort of adopted heading into the conversations? There's no defined negotiation date started yet, but how
isn't that in itself fascinating? I mean, you have Marcelo Ebrard rushing into a negotiation, or to at least have discussions, and the Carney government has been much more cautious and standoffish and playing this game of sort of strategic patience, which, I mean, it is interesting to compare and contrast. I'm sure there's somebody out there who's going to write their doctoral thesis about this, but I find that fascinating. And to Eric's point about how do you sell even a good deal to a Canadian electorate that is, frankly, highly dubious and suspicious of the current U.S. administration, that's going to be a major challenge, I think, for the Canadian government going forward. Even if it is a good deal, I'm not going to say what a good deal is, but certainly diminution of the tariffs to a politically acceptable level would be one element. Dairy is long-standing issue with national unity, fractures possible. What would be acceptable on that front? So
No, that's great.
If you let me just insist, Marta, just quickly, one thing.
Por favor.
Certainty. And I think this applies also for Canada. Certainty. We need to bring back certainty to the business investment environment in North America. Let's see how the rules look like. But we need
depends certainty. On the U.S. electorate, doesn't it? More than on us.
Yeah, but elections in the U.S. are in November. We have to do this by July. So even waiting for the political temperature in the U.S. to change or go down is still long, even if it is here, no?
Yeah.
Eric, do you want to comment on that? Yep.
Yeah, so in terms of what makes a good deal, I mean, a good deal is something like reciprocity on
Mm,
tariff
yeah.
treatment, some protections around the future application of broad countrywide tariffs. I mean, there's always been the use of trade remedies on individual products, but where things are different now is that Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 of the United States is being used more on countrywide investigations. But the big element that would be hard for Canada to swallow, I think, would be embedded structural inequality.
Mm,
And so if you had something like a Japan style deal where you had a 15% tariff imposed on Canadian goods heading to the US and zero tariffs on US goods heading to Canada, given the very different structures of our economic relationships, that gets very hard to address. And the US is insistent on tariffs. Canada has not agreed to that. I mean, in many respects, there's a threshold beyond which certain industries are not viable. And so, if there are tariffs, there are tariffs as low as possible. And so ultimately, a deal that's worth signing is one that can deliver benefits without capping growth over the long term. And so that's something which I think is going to be crucially important to keep in mind.
Can I ask both Graham and Eric, Marta? I'm sorry, but I'm a bit skeptical, even if I understand the not the idea of diversification, which is something
mm,
Mexico has always pursued. We all have pursued that, but it has limits, right? Geography
hmm.
imposes very important
Yeah, of
limits,
course.
and our trade with the U.S. is around both countries 75, 80%. So yes, we can diversify, but it has limits. The level of integration is very substantial. To what extent is really realistic the idea of let's just leave the treaty and we move on for Canada is a question.
I mean, this is not something that people in Canada want, but to quote former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley, he said, "Look, free trades work well for us, but if we can't have it, we can't have it." Canada is not looking to walk away from this, but if we're looking at a situation where there's no free trade and what's on the table is a 15% tariff differential between the two countries, then that raises a lot
Mhm.
of questions. And
Sure,
nobody it wants to end up in that situation. And but if you don't have
sure.
free trade, there will still be lots of trade with the
Yeah,
U.S.
yeah,
because of geographic
yeah,
proximity. But
yeah.
one of the things that I would highlight is the strategy which the CCA itself has put out late last year. In the trade chapter, we lay out specific strategies that are not currently being used that should be used to grow Canada's trade with Latin America. And a lot of that is learning from countries like Japan and Korea, who've been very successful in trading globally, including setting up lots of operations in Mexico. And so
Mhm.
diversification itself is not, okay, we don't have the agreement, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. It's about learning a whole new way to
Yeah,
survive and remain prosperous. And so we don't want the nuclear explosion, but if it comes, then Canada will ultimately have to deal with
yeah,
that.
yeah.
I
Well,
think
no, that would
that's a
apply to Mexico too. That we, of course.
well, would it, Juan Jose? I mean, I think it was very interesting, listening to Stephen Harper, our former prime minister, 6 months ago or a year ago, saying that, if he were prime minister, he'd be prepared to share in economic pain for the country if there wasn't. I don't remember exactly what he said, Eric. You're looking dubious. He did say something along the lines that, Canadians would be able to put up with a certain amount of economic pain. And I think Canadians are prepared to put up with a certain amount of economic pain and are, fairly united behind the posture of the government. I'm not convinced that Mexico is on the same page.
No. Let me, yeah, I agree. No, first, what I mean, one thing is the diversification. I totally agree.
Yeah, right. Okay.
You should pursue it. We should pursue it. No doubt. But it has limits. No, there are limits and takes time because geography is geography. No, my point is to what extent, obviously, if, as Eric says, if the result of the negotiation is catastrophic, what is catastrophic, period? Is a nuclear bomb, is a nuclear bomb. So the world changes. North America changes. That's a different story. But let's stay on the possibilities that there will be a treaty that should be workable. No, my question is diversification, yes, but can you really? I don't want to use the word delink because it's not the idea, but a no treaty between Canada and the US, where does all the massive mutual investment would be left? I don't know. This is a very technical question for which you may have the answer. Me, no, and I'm sure Eric does, but I don't see it that easily. And the economic pain is not 6 months of pain. The economic pain, back to your question of politics, the threshold of pain that societies can take has limits. And it's reflected immediately electorally. So that's where I have my doubts. In the case of Mexico, no, Mexico wants the treaty. Mexico, and that's why you see the government and Marcelo with a very proactive, assertive strategy to get this done. No?
I think I think one of the things that's really fundamental here, that from what Ambassador Gómez-Camacho has said, is that what we are seeing now is a process that I don't think thinks enough about what happens if this goes away. I think back to my beloved Taylor Swift, who said, "You play stupid games, you win stupid prizes." And we're playing stupid games right now. And what we're risking is a catastrophe economically. Because if this fails, it fails badly. If the U.S. tariffs go back in on Canada, Canada will retaliate, and there'll be other things. And then all of those exporters who have been used to shipping stuff to supermarkets in Canada, for example, from the U.S. will now have to pay 25% tariffs. And they'll have to look at what that all means. And so this is not just a technical discussion. We also have to keep in mind that we've got a really, really good deal going here, and we can't mess around with it enough. And we can't mess around with it too much, or we're going to end up in a situation where, we're going to be singing Taylor Swift because we have nothing else to do. No jobs.
I agree. That was my point. Yeah.
Graeme, did you want to comment on that as well? And
I just on diversification, I want to say l'un n'empêche pas l'autre. You can be heavily invested in our North American future and at the same time diversify, right? And that's I think if that's what happens at the end of the day, then that's good certainly good for Canada. I don't hear the same message coming out of Mexico, but maybe I just haven't been paying attention to the right interlocutors like Juan José Gómez-Camacho.
No, listen, you just need to see, on that, you just need to see how many free trade agreements we have.
I know.
And that's not pro forma.
No,
that's precisely because Mexico has always pursued diversification and more global trade. But again, geography is geography.
One of the most interesting bilateral relationships to watch in the next 10 years is Mexico-Vietnam, because they're partners in CPTPP. And as China gets choked off, Vietnam comes in at a price point not that dissimilar from China. And all of a sudden you have those kind of fascinating interconnections.
I agree.
Well, we all agree with each other.
If only you guys were all the negotiators.
That's what Taylor will do to you, Graeme.
I do recognize the time, and I will take moderator's prerogative here to close it off. But I wanted to thank the three of you for this really rich and timely conversation. I'm sure we'll be coming back to each of you Thank you to Graeme and Eric, Juan José.
Thank you so much.
Also, just want to highlight Graeme and Eric are both CCA board members, so thank you for your time and energy as well. And also like to invite all of those who are following us right now to follow us on social media and stay informed about upcoming CCA events and programming, and to remind everyone that the videos in English, French, and Spanish will be available on our website and our YouTube page. So thank you all again. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Have a fabulous day. Thanks, everybody.
Great to see you. Graeme,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Eric, good to see you both.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Cheers.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
Ciao.